terms of Australia, we've had some experience of this and of its international dimensions, haven't we, Nick?
That's right. All the speakers raise, I guess, the huge scale of the problem. And the Australian case study I'll talk about provides a bit of a solution. There's a very small team in my home state of Victoria called the Southern Stars. I'd never heard of them. They were sort of our third-tier soccer league in Australia. The Australian Soccer Federation had contracted a company called Sports Radar, which monitors international betting movements, to do some work for it. And Sports Radar, an analyst sitting in London, was after hours looking at some very, very strange betting patterns involving this tiny team in this tiny league in Victoria. And he thought, this is really odd. So he contacted the Sports Federation, and they did a very clever thing. They reached out to the police immediately, and they knew that they did not have the investigative capacity themselves to run an investigation. So an organised crime police task force in Victoria, which had previously specialised in murder investigations, gangland killings and drug trafficking, said, let's tackle this as we would an organised crime investigation. And let's do it in an extraordinarily quick time frame, 6 weeks of turnaround. So they looked at all the telephones of the players in the team, they looked at the betting information, and very quickly they had cell phones in Australia, pinging to cell phones in Asia, and then to cell phones in Europe. And they also looked at the travel patterns of the players in this very small Victorian team, and they found that quite a number of the players from this tiny Victorian team had played for a third-tier British team. They'd left a competition where they were paid, say, £20,000 a year to go to an Australian competition where they were paid £2,000 a year. Why would they do that? Now, combining all this information, the Victoria Police realised what we've got on our hands is probably a match-fixing syndicate. The betting data shows that something is amiss here. The phone information shows that there's contact with international elements. They needed more information. So what the Victoria Police then did was to reach out to an international NGO called the International Centre for Sports Security. Again, a very unusual thing here. We've got a sports body reaching out to a state police force that then reached out to an international NGO. Now, that international NGO monitors sports corruption, and it had the numbers of certain match fixers around the world and was able to say to the Victoria Police, these numbers you've got from Asia to Hungary actually provide an evidentiary chain linking your tiny team in Victoria to Raj Perumal, which is one of the most notorious match fixers in the world. He came up in the previous speech. On the basis of all that information, the Victoria Police said, right, let's arrest, let's charge, let's interview, but let's forget about tough penalties. We know that our court system does not regard betting fraud still as seriously as it should. Let's go for publicity here. Let's try these players before minor court, and some of the cases are still going on, but we'll get guilty pleas very quickly. We can send them back home, but the key element of this prosecution will be exposure and accountability and cultural change. And of course, the end goal as well is the international aspect of this investigation. The Victoria Police want to extradite Raj Perumal from where he sits now in Hungary to Australia to face trial. And I'll finish up here. One of the really huge problems of this goal is Raj Perumal, while he was match fixing in Australia in connection with Asian organised crime syndicates, he at the very same time was working with the Hungarian authorities to fight match fixing as an informer or a witness in Europe. So clearly the Hungarian authorities are giving this man a long leash, and I guess what this example really shows is the need to work across borders, to work with civil agencies and policing agencies, and to work with harmony. So you have the Hungarian authorities and the Australian authorities on the same map. Your backyard now is not your local patch, it's the world. That's the nature of international betting, and that's a key fact that all sports agencies need to take into mind when they move forward to combat this corruption.
But Nick, if this shows us that, doesn't it show something else? I mean, was about discovery and about prosecution, but what? 5 players turn up offering essentially to play for free, and where's the integrity regime or the integrity protections to not raise an alarm bell at that point and say, well, there's something wrong here? As a sport, doesn't sport also have to say, well, we've got to have the safeguards in place to prevent this?
Absolutely. The key challenge for sport is hardening the environment, because you'll never win police will never win against drug trafficking, and sport will never win against the match fixers because they're wealthier, they're more nimble, they're more flexible, and they can operate in jurisdictions where they can act with impunity. So it's about hardening the environment. And what Australian soccer learnt from this is they should have had a system of alarm bells in place when these players rocked up from nowhere in a really suspicious manner. That should have sent the highest alarm bells ringing, or at least triggered some alarm, and that did not happen. But the good thing is these sorts of case studies and these sorts of cases do end up changing culture. And so what you have now is an Australian Soccer Federation that into the future will be looking at these sorts of travel movements, these sorts of players from international competitions with far greater scrutiny, and that's got to be a good thing.
Okay, you mentioned change in culture. Let's take another sport, cricket. Let's go through the history. The Mr. John bookmaker case, Rob O'Regan, QC, is appointed to look into that. He doesn't think that the Australian Cricket Board's done a good job, sort of papered over it, and the fines that it handed out to the offending players, you know, really just a slap on the wrist. Then you've got Hansi Cronje, and that sort of, you know, really does bring the international cricket community to take action, and they establish the Anti-Corruption and Security Unit. That's in place for 10 years, and it takes the news of the world to discover match fixing. So it's not just a function of budget, and it's not just a function of publicising the issue, is it?
I mean, absolutely not. The lesson for cricket around the world is that if you don't expose the corruption in your sport, the media will. Nothing remains hidden in the modern world, especially with communications being what they are, and the media in many places being very aggressive. In the case that you've talked about, it did take the News of the World, a newspaper which has had its own corruption problems, to be fair, to run a sting. And they basically had a journalist wire himself up and entrap some Pakistani cricket players who were agreeing to pass on information about, to allow people to spot fix, saying a certain player will be doing a certain something during this game, and the earning capacity, bowling no balls, bowling illegal deliveries. And the earning capacity with that information was extraordinary. But again, I think what the News of the World case really highlighted was the failure of the preceding 2 decades to actually attack and ferociously acknowledge the corruption issues facing the sport of cricket. Meant that the sport was really vulnerable. So the media could come in and pluck a pretty easy apple from the tree. And the lesson there is, as sporting administrators, you're much smarter to get on the front foot. And when there is corruption, to deal with it in a public fashion. There's nothing better and cleaner than a quick mea culpa, and therefore you can control your corruption issues rather than ceding control to the press, which can then run amok and really do great damage to your sport.
ICC and other cricket boards only are reactive. They have never been able to nip the evil in the bud. It is either a sting operation by the police or by the media, or a tapping by the police, which unearth these factors.
Well, that leads me to the question I wanted to pose to you, Justice Mugdal. I'm going to come to Mark in a moment. He's made the point very strongly that the evidence demonstrates in the UK that the criminal justice system, to use his phrase, isn't up to scratch. You've advised on the drafting of the Sporting Fraud Bill. So plainly you feel criminal sanctions are a part of the remedy, and you also talk about coordination between the sport and the criminal enforcement authorities, the law enforcement authorities. But who does what? Who's to carry out the investigations? What's the right balance?
Well, the investigation has to be carried out by the criminal law forces, because the powers of tapping, they have to take permission for that, are not available with the ICC Anti-Corruption Unit. That's one of the grounds given by the ICC to say that we cannot tap, we cannot invade privacy, would be hit with civil suits. So therefore, investigation has to be done by the policing authorities.
But do they, A, have the resourcing, B, have the inclination to do it? Do they have the experience to know what they're looking for and then to bring the prosecution? I mean, these are very real issues that we've seen in other countries.
No, I think the police investigating officers may not have the cricketing knowledge, and generally don't have. They may be fans, but the knowledge of how the game is being played, who's trying to tank, this, I think they should involve a reputed player, a former player, to analyze what's happening. And once that happens, I think things will improve. as an advisor or as a part of the team.
Mark, your comments?
Well, the problem with what was called the City of London case, which is the collapsed prosecution, was a lack of expert knowledge and expert evidence being available to the police. I think they're capable of investigating these cases and prosecuting them because they actually resemble very closely drug importation conspiracies and cases of that kind in terms of the kind of evidence that are presented. The real problem in that case was proving to the criminal standard, as Patrick mentioned, that the racists were fixed. And they couldn't do it because they couldn't get adequate expert evidence to prove that, and that's where the case collapsed. In the wake of that, the prosecuting authorities, the law enforcement bodies in the UK have been very, very wary about pursuing match-fixing cases, and they haven't pursued any horse racing cases. The News of the World case was handed to them on a plate, and I think that the thing that's most worrying about that was, why did the source go to the News of the World rather than anywhere else? And the answer is, they didn't trust. It's not just the money that they may have been paid, but they didn't trust the other authorities to do anything about it, which is a very worrying situation.
Well, this ties in with what Patrick had said about the different standards of proof that are required in a criminal prosecution and in administrative proceedings. And you've illustrated, particularly with all the case studies you gave us, but there's a very nice judgment that you showed there on your slide about the Ahern case in terms of the willingness of the appeal board to accept that the sexual times, one, could be presented as fact, and then inferences could be drawn from that. But the difficulty that I've seen in other jurisdictions is the willingness of administrative bodies to accept that these circumstantial cases can meet, say, the Brigginshaw standard. I mean, certainly that's been the experience in Victoria. And in New South Wales.
Well, I don't know, maybe other people have better insight into that. I think that the key to it, as I said in my remarks, is that you've got to present as full a picture as you possibly can. If you have, for instance, a series of phone calls made to a man who's known to be a buyer of inside information and a series of actions by him which imply that he's acting on information received, it's pretty difficult to provide a plausible response to that within a disciplinary proceeding. And if the jockey comes along, as some have, and said, well, he was my tailor, I was talking to him about a suit I wanted to buy, well, that's not a very credible answer, especially when the contact takes place before and immediately after the race has taken place, as you could see on that slide.
Dale, have you felt some frustration?
Yes, Andrew. In 2010 was the Betfair case where a horse at Mornington called Finishing Card was ridden by jockey Danny Nikolic, and Betfair alerted us to some suspicious betting activity in relation to that ride, which triggered an investigation which went back through a number of rides by Danny Nikolic and then associates that he was communicating with. This was the first case of its kind for Victoria, and it was a paradigm shift because generally the stewards see a ride and the ride has issues about it that on an objective view would lead you to part of the evidence to suggest that there's been a breach of the rule. Here was a case where the objectiveness of the ride was all right. So you looked at it and you didn't have any concern with it that you could lead evidence from. And it came down to a circumstantial case, and we didn't get to the Brigginshaw standard in that case, and the board felt that, albeit that there were these communications, they weren't comfortably satisfied that information passing on led to this commission agent laying particular bets. And there was also another complex level on that. The commission agent that was putting the bets on, we tried to get his records, phone records, and then subsequently we would look at getting his betting data. But unfortunately, he wasn't subject to the rules of racing. We relied on a Privy Council decision in 1937 called the Naylor and Stevens, and the board on appeal said that the Privy Council didn't apply because the High Court now is the ruling body in Australia, and this case is outdated, and really people can't bring themselves into the purview of the rules because it's by contract and licence. So we failed on a few levels, and it was frustrating at the time. Yes.
Patrick, what's your prescription for sport more generally?
Can I come on to that in a sec?
Yes,
because I want to really just come into this point because I think it's interesting. You know, when I work with FIFA, when I work with UEFA, when I work with Interpol, they are absolutely desperate for what the QC wants: wiretaps, evidence, video surveillance, etc., etc. I can't provide that. That's not my job. No. But I know what a football crime scene looks like. I put the slide up there, and can I go into a court of law and swear by Almighty God that this game was fixed? Absolutely not. I can't do that. I don't have that. I've looked after 500,000 football games in 20 years. I know what to look for. I know when there's a problem. And what I would ask, sports governing bodies and police and law enforcement is to consider, the development of expert witnesses to be able to explain the betting markets, to able to say, look, this is what's happened and this is what this means. Everybody in this room's got, their smartphone or iPad with them or whatever. And, the Dow Jones last night closed at 16,500, there or thereabouts. If you open your machine now and it says 14,000 or 18,000, something very, very serious has happened. Well, that's what happens in the betting markets. Now, we can look to explain that. And if we find a logical reason, that's great. But if we exhaust all reasons and can't find a logical reason, then we start saying, well, maybe there's an integrity issue here. In terms of prescription, I think the Jockey Club model is fantastic, and I would look no further than, our chief stipendiary stewards, Kim Kelly and their team, who do an absolutely incredible job on monitoring betting markets and monitoring sporting events, And what it comes down to for me there is immediacy. And this is where there's a difference between having a court case 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, and our friends on the beach earning 20%, and bringing the jockeys in or players in immediately after the race or the game and go, now look, what were you doing here? We need an explanation. And you have a stewarding panel of experts who are able to then digest the information that's given them and determine whether it's reasonable or determine actually whether it's not reasonable and therefore whether punishments are due. I do think immediacy is key.
And I know from what you said in your presentation, Dale, you'd agree with that. Say, for example, the BC3 example, jump in and get on the front foot, get the evidence in and deal with it. Now, Patrick, pointing particularly to the crime scene, what's happened in the betting market, and that's potent evidence. The other thing that sort of goes into the mix in terms of making these circumstantial cases is the evidence that information has been passed on. And you alluded to a recent decision that creates a difficulty there in terms of characterising that as corrupt.
Yeah, over the years we've prosecuted a number of cases where it's not possible to prove that the match has been fixed, the race has been fixed. You look at the ride, you can't see anything wrong with it. But if you look at the other end of the picture, the betting market, it's perfectly clear that something wrong has happened. If the picture is clear enough, we've run a lot of cases on the basis that some form of inside information has clearly been passed by the jockey. It may not be, I'm going to stop this horse, because we can't see it happening. It may be some inside information they've got from riding out, something from the yard, or something else. We don't know what it is, but we can infer from the activity in the betting market following communication from the jockey that something's gone wrong. We've prosecuted those as cases of corruption or cases of selling inside information. On one recent occasion, the panel did not find that there'd been reward for the passing of inside information. So that rule didn't apply. Question, was this therefore a corrupt conspiracy on the assumption that no money changed hands and you can't prove that the horse was interfered with, the rider was interfered with? They said no. Well, that was a novel decision. I think it was wrong. It's contrary to what the High Court said in the McEwen case. And I'd hope that they take a different view. But I think what's going to happen is the rules will be altered to cover that kind of case.
Very good.
You might like to consider
Yes.
the case of Rajat Gupta, former McKinsey director, who after the Goldman Sachs meeting made a phone call to his friend Rajatnam, who immediately traded in shares which were discussed in the meeting, and that led to conviction in the US court.
Yes.
That analogy may be considered.
Well, one of the difficulties with inside information in horse racing is that it's not quite the same as in other markets. There are some people, owners for example, who are it's perfectly legitimate for them to use inside information. In fact, that's one of the reasons that people get into being owners, to back their horses when they want to. So it's not possible to have quite such rigorous rules about inside information in horse racing.
Now, I'm going to give the audience the opportunity to pose questions. Are there any questions? Oh, yes. A sea of hands. Down the back.
Well done to all the speakers, by the way. Very compelling. I'll be a bit biased and I'll ask my fellow Victorian representative, Dale Brown. Dale, you've got this control room concept. How have you informed the trainers and the jockeys of this concept, and what's been their reaction?
Am I on? Right, yep. At this point in time, it's a pilot program. We've spoken to some of the stakeholders about it. While it's in the pilot phase, we're looking to iron out some bugs that are in it. I think when we're ready to go with it statewide and look at it from a more global perspective, we'll start to put some sort of guidelines in place and the way we'll operate it, because when jockeys are in the room being questioned, they've got to be aware of who's there and who's not. We've got a facility in the room at the moment. When the stewards have an inquiry, they can mute out the people in the remote room. The people in the remote room are only there to provide information to the stewards. They're not there to run the inquiry. They're there as a tool. So when we go forward and look at putting it more statewide, we'll probably look at putting more rigorous guidelines in to ensure that everyone's comfortable with the way it works.
Thanks, Dale. There are another couple of hands down the back.
Hi, my question is to Justice Mugdal. In India, and specific to horse racing, one of the biggest problems is that within the framework of maintaining integrity, the police don't have the teeth, and the judicial system normally doesn't interfere because the bodies are quasi-judicial bodies. Has the new bill taken care or touched upon this at all?
Yeah, it does. It does. The sporting fraud is defined in a very wide manner, and it will take care of this. But there's a strong provision. The Parliament has to enact it. It's only a bill.
Very good, thank you. Now, I'm going to give each of the panellists an opportunity to make a final observation before we conclude the session, starting with you, Nick.
I guess just a quick one. We have the WADA body, which is the World Anti-Doping Body, which has a very low, sometimes, level of proof and operates across the globe with extraordinarily strict penalties. Do we need some sort of an international, maybe it's a pie-in-the-sky sort of thing, sports corruption body which would harness and license racing bodies, soccer bodies, and at least provide some global cohesive system of investigation and penalty? I think it's sorely lacking and needs to be something that's developed.
Thanks, Nick. I see you nodding there, Patrick.
I think this is a problem that we've never seen before, and therefore creating institutions to deal with problems we've never seen before, which are new, is probably a good idea, because the existing institutions, are not designed to deal with them and are not dealing with them particularly effectively. I also think that betting operators need to think about the very deep relationship between, their own reputation, their own customers, their own financial positions, and indeed, this issue of sporting integrity, because I think, everyone's got a role to play. And, the sports governing bodies want us to play a role. The media are keen for us to play. The lawyers say, can you help? So there is definitely, there's convergence there. And whether some kind of WADA-like organisation is the way forward, or whether we need to partner with the existing organisations. What I would say, because I've sounded a bit pessimistic today, and I don't want to be pessimistic, is the governing bodies have made a lot of progress in the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, compared to where they were 4 years ago, they are making progress, which is good.
Thanks. Dale?
Yeah, look, I agree with what Patrick and Nick have both said, and I think going forward, integrity has to evolve to a point where you have skill sets within your integrity organisation which are diverse. They can deal with all the different issues that arise, assist the stewards, and I think collaboration and harmonisation on a national and international level is key, because at the moment we've got a legal bookmaking which is penetrating different sports and into Australia. We know it's there, we can't see it, we don't visualise it because they're not under our Racefields legislation. These are really important and key elements which can only be addressed on an international and national basis.
I agree with the suggestion of the international cooperation, but as far as prosecution is concerned, you will get issues of international law, international treaties. Sharing of information, I'm all for. Otherwise, it will take a very long time to have an international body.
Thank you. Mark?
I think the system of risk and reward needs attention in the meantime. I agree with all of that. I said it in the presentation, but I think that the risks that people run in undertaking match fixing are not big enough. What sports governing bodies can do is to attack the problem in their sport. They can't govern Hungarian match fixers or people in Panama or other places around the world. But if they attack their own sporting participants with serious sanctions, it may be a bit harsh, but it's the only way that they can directly affect the continuation of integrity problems, I think.
Thank you. Gentlemen, each of you has made an outstanding contribution to our discussion today. I've enjoyed it, and I think everyone here has gained a lot from it. I would invite you to join me in thanking the panel.